Hi, everybody. My name is Missy Smith, and this is Developing Interventions That Make a Difference. Just a little bit about myself. I am a seventh year school counselor at Lincoln Elementary in Norman, and I'm really proud to say that this past year we achieved the RAMP designation for our school. Something that I'm also really proud of is I do serve as a RAMP reviewer, and so if you are ever interested in achieving RAMP as an Oklahoma school counselor, I really want to be a resource for you, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the process or about the application that you are developing. And I'm also right now serving as the current OSCA president, and so once again, it's just really my desire to be a resource and help to you in any way that I can. So talking a little bit about what we are, I don't want to say what we're up against, but just sort of what's going on in our state. We can see here that there are some statistics that are troubling. So one of the things that we think about is that 1 in 5 of youth aged 9 to 17 has a diagnosable mental disorder. And one of the things that I think is really significant to talk about is that it's been estimated that over half of the students who drop out of school have a diagnosable psychiatric disorder. I did include some Oklahoma-specific statistics on here, which is that 10% of Oklahoma youth have mental illness, and that we have one of the highest numbers of ACE scores in the nation. And this certainly is not meant to be fear-mongering, because most students don't struggle with mental illness. But it is important for us to keep these statistics in mind when we are discussing student behavior, because we have to make sure that we're considering student mental health when we are responding to student behavior. And one of the other things that we need to think about is the true impact that it makes. It's a circular problem a lot of the times, because obviously these students with mental health disorders display behavioral problems that disrupt our classrooms. They don't have the skill set to meet classroom expectations or manage their emotions. And while responding these behaviors do take a lot of time and effort, the real impact lies in students. So we can see that, the students have a hard time at school, the schools have a hard time responding, and if we're not equipped very well, we make school harder for these students, and they make school harder for us, and the cycle continues. But like I had mentioned just a second ago, the real impact is on students, because students with behavioral disorders often are feeling disconnected, they have stunted outcomes, and a diminished sense of happiness. And we as school counselors are often the first responders. We have the knowledge to help educators better understand these students and how to develop interventions that will help these students. And so just a few considerations to think about before we get down to the development of interventions. So the first thing is that if a child has a mental health disorder, the child comes first and the label comes second. A diagnosis can be a starting point, but it doesn't give us the full picture. It can tell us some things, but not all the important stuff, like what a student likes or what their interests are, how they enjoy spending their free time, what they're good at or what they worry about. And also, two students with the same diagnosis can behave in vastly different ways. And so we really need to be providing individualized interventions. Their diagnosis is a small part of who they are, but it's definitely not the most important part. Have you ever heard of a person call a student by their diagnosis before, like, he's an ADHD kid? This is language that we really want to stay away from, because yeah, he might be a student with ADHD, but he's also creative and compassionate and kind. And we need as much of that full picture as we can to develop effective interventions for students. And the next thing is honestly a standalone topic that needs its own presentation for, and I cannot do justice to this whole topic in just a few slides, but I would be totally remiss not to cover it at all. The first thing that we need to do as we develop interventions is we need to examine ourselves. One of the most significant presentations that I have seen, I've actually seen her twice, once at the ASCA National Conference and then once again at the OSCA Conference, was the presentation, The Miseducation of Black Girls. And Carletta Hurt, the presenter, talks about some examples of preconceived notions that people might have in regards to Black girls specifically. So some of those include Black females being perceived as more dominant and morally loose. And she also brought up that there was a report that found that educators believed that Black girls deserve less nurturing, less protection, and support and comforting. The biggest takeaway I had from her presentation is the term of adultification. Black girls are all often held to higher standards that are really for students that are aged 5 to 10 years older than them. So, or 5 to 7 years, I should say. So what that really means is that a 10-year-old Black girl would be held to the same standard that one would expect a 15-year-old girl to meet. So, or think about that as a kindergartner, a 5-year-old Black girl being expected to meet the standards and expectations that we would typically expect a 10-year-old to be able to do. These are things we must be willing to check on. We have to ask ourselves things like, is this behavior developmentally appropriate, or do I just expect more? Be willing to have these courageous conversations with the teachers in your buildings as well, because we know that students of color are disproportionately suspended and disciplined, and we have to consider these things when building our interventions. And we also have to be willing to consider the possibility that some of the things that we're seeing students struggle with is that they're responding to or reacting to situations of racism. One study found that 77% of African American adolescents reported experiencing at least one discriminatory incident in the previous 3 months. So like I said before, there's so much to unpack here. But the real core message that I want to give is that we have to do our own work. We have to examine our practices. We have to explore our biases, and we have to listen to students of color when they say they are experiencing discrimination. One of the ways that you can do this is by taking the implicit association test regarding race, which can help you explore your bias. That's actually something that I have linked in my presentation notes, so you'll be able to access the link to that. But we have to remember that we all do have biases. So doing the work to become aware can help us keep ourselves in check as we work to better serve students who aren't just like us. And this is an amazing resource that I found from, the acronym escapes me right now, but I believe it's called I linked it in the meeting notes. So this organization is, here it is. It's the School Organization for School Leadership for Social Justice. So I've included the link to both the organization and the resource in the meeting notes. So the next thing that we need to talk about is our scope of practice, because many school counselors, myself included, are both certified as a school counselor and licensed to practice therapy. And our graduate programs do a good job of ensuring that we are well versed in the areas of mental health. So it's safe to say that we are mental health experts in our building. But what we must remember is that our scope of practice should be short-term and solution-focused. So this isn't always easy to ensure, because we definitely don't want to leave students hanging out with unmet mental health needs. And we know that there are often times that we refer students for services that they unfortunately do not receive. So we need to have a good list of referrals ready. And while we are knowledgeable and capable, we do want to make referral a priority, because if we are spending the majority of our time on a few students, then it becomes an issue of equity and access, because every student deserves access to the school counseling program. And so while we're on the subject of where our time should be, we need to remember that we should really be spending most of our time in the Tier 1 setting, which is the proactive and preventative side of things. So this is actually an excerpt from a presentation at the National School Counseling Leadership Conference that I attended earlier this month. And I think we're going to be seeing and hearing a shift in our language coming up in the near future when it comes to MTSS. So the difference between MTSS, which is multi-tiered services or systems of support, is that MTSS is actually multi-tiered, multi-domained systems of support. So this gives us more of a school counselor focus because it can help us map out our services and interventions across the multiple domains that we address in our positions. And in the meeting notes, I have attached a link to a short video that does a really great job of explaining this. But I'm not here to teach this part of it. But the big idea in this slide is that we really do need to spend our time in that Tier 1, because by spending more of our time in the preventative services, we're able to give every student a foundation for future success. And yes, I know this presentation is primarily focused on Tier 2 interventions, but I just wanted to take a moment to say that we are often encouraged to push aside our Tier 1 services, because Tier 1 is considered the priority, since the students in need of those services are often disruptive and defiant. But the problem with this is if we're always running around putting out fires, then we can't ever get in front of the problem. So we need to be trying to prevent fires from starting in the first place. And by focusing on Tier 1 services, this ensures that all students have access to your amazing knowledge and skill set and benefit from your program. And the other good news is that even the students that need Tier 2 services will benefit from your Tier 1 ones. So I'm going to step down from my soapbox about that, but just with one last reminder that every student should benefit from your knowledge and skill set, not just a small population. And so now moving on, even with a great Tier 1 system in place, there will still be students who need additional supports. And so I'm first going to start out with an overview of the intervention development process. And then we're going to spend just a little bit of the rest of the time talking about some specific interventions for some of the disorders that we see frequently at school. So the first thing is, number one, do something different. And the next few slides actually come from the book, The School Counselor's Mental Health Sourcebook. And it's a book that I really highly recommend because it's very helpful and a very easy read. I've read it as part of I'm currently working on the ASCII mental health specialist training. And so I've linked both that book and the ASCII training in my session notes, because I really have learned a lot from reading this book and the other publications that come along with the training. So like I said, the first point is to do something different. And we're all like, yeah, like Missy, duh, but are we really focusing on how we really are focusing on what the school can do differently and how the school can accommodate these students? I really and truly believe that kids do well when they can. Ross Greene, in his book Lost at School, talks about how students who struggle have lagging skills and unmet needs. And we are educators. We must teach. And sometimes that's not teaching math, but that is teaching a student's skills in order to be successful. I once had a conversation with a former teacher who said, yeah, I just don't have time to do that. And my rebuttal to her was, well, you put the time in either way. Either you're putting the time in responding to the issue, or you can put the time in proactively by teaching the skill. Either way, you're responding to this this issue, this behavior. But if we can teach the skill, we really wind up with so much more time later on that we can, and that we will be able to see academic growth from that student and the rest of the class, because they're also being able to focus more and longer and have more of your attention as the classroom teacher or as the educator. And so these really aren't even large changes that we always have to make. Sometimes it's just minor things like giving a student a heads up that the class is about to transition, or looking at a student's schedule to see, hey, what time of day are they really in the best state to learn? And if we can figure that out, we're going to put the harder classes academically during that time. And this is also an area where your skills and advocacy and collaboration really come in handy. So there are times where educators will say things like, I've tried everything. And what that usually means is I've tried everything I know to try, or I've used my usual tools and they didn't work. And in those cases, you may be able to suggest different ideas and different perspectives. So one of the things that I love from the trust-based relational intervention model is the phrase, become curious instead of furious. So we begin to ask questions instead of pointing fingers. This helps us to stay compassionate and open to helping. So an important part of taking a problem-solving approach is to seek to understand the triggers and the maintaining variables, meaning what elicits that problem behavior, and then what enforces the behavior to where the student continues to behave that way. And point number 3 is be faithful but not rigid. And so we use the term treatment fidelity usually in therapy, but the book that this comes out of uses the term, and I do think it does give us a good understanding of what faithful but not rigid really means. We need to be consistent, but we don't have to be perfect. We need to keep things practical and simple because, after all, most of the interventions will be done in the classroom. And the classroom teacher wants to help, but they also have so much to manage. So the simpler, the more likely it is to be done, and the more likely it is to be implemented correctly. And this is obviously related to the previous tip. If the teacher does not buy into the intervention, it won't be done, plain and simple. And so we have to show them that we are with them in this, not that we think that they aren't doing something right. Teachers give so much of themselves for students, and if they believe the intervention will help the students succeed, they most likely will do it. Listen to them when they share what they're hoping to accomplish and what they've noticed, because they see those students all day and in many cases know them better than we do. When you think you might need to have teachers think of something outside of the box or try something new that they're not totally comfortable with, make sure to take the time to explain your rationale so that they can understand and be willing to consider the intervention, as well as understanding it enough to apply with fidelity. Make sure that they feel supported and equipped as they're starting this new intervention process. So a little about me time. I actually worked in community mental health for about 7 years before moving into the schools, and most of my time was at an agency in Tulsa until my family moved back to the OKC area where I'm from originally. The new agency that I worked at had a collaborative note-taking process, which initially threw me totally for a loop because I was used to documenting my sessions with the client, or I was really used to documenting the sessions without the client present. So I felt the freedom to be 100% truthful. So when they told me that, they actually took notes, this new agency took notes with the clients in the room, I started to think like, how am I going to do this? Because there were times that I documented things that I really didn't want to say to the client's face. But then I realized like, those are actually things I should talk about. Because isn't that part of the process? If a client comes in and I notice they're more cranky than usual, then I can say something like, "Hey, I noticed you didn't seem like yourself. Did I say something that bothered you, or is there something that bothering you?" And these give opportunities for meaningful discussions that I might not have had. So I ended up actually loving that process. And I also feel like the clients started to even trust me more because they took ownership of what was going in their chart about them, and they knew what I was saying about them and so the same thing with students. We need to get their buy-in. We need to let them have a voice in their success. Getting them involved in their intervention is key, but they need to know what you all are working on together, and they need to have a say in how it happens. I think a lot of times students are pulled into the school counselor's office with no idea as to why they're meeting. And maybe the school counselor is playing a game to teach them frustration tolerance, or maybe they're weaving in conversations about coping skills, but the student might just really think, why me? Why are they pulling me? Kids need to know about this, and most kids are really capable of participating in discussions about their interventions. They're often an untapped resource, and they know themselves and what works for them. So we need to give them a say and include them in the process. And so the next thing is to begin with positive interventions, because like we talked about earlier, positive interventions help teach those lagging skills. We assume that students already know how to act and that they have the skills necessary to be successful. And that really just might not be true. And sometimes I'll hear teachers say, like, they had a really good day today, so I know they can do it. Well, they could do it today. Maybe all the stars aligned and everything they needed was present in today. How can we examine that and recreate that day for them and provide accommodations that made today really special for them? Or maybe they just don't have the endurance and they've held it all together Monday through Thursday and they just can't anymore on Friday. So just because they've done it once before doesn't mean they can always do it. And so we can't assume that students have the skills to be successful all the time. If their parent spends most of their time in another room and the student has to yell through the door to get to them, to get their attention, how would they know what an inside voice is? And so the book that I've been quoting in these slides, the School Counselor's Mental Health Sourcebook, has a really good metaphor for this. So it says, imagine that you were at work and your boss stood over your shoulder and commented about everything you did wrong. How connected would you feel? How valued would you feel? Well, the big difference in this analogy is that you can quit your job. You can find another place to leave, but students don't have the power. And so that's why we don't want to focus on the punitive and we don't want to nitpick and nag. It's just going to further make that student feel disconnected. And yes, there are people who push back on the notion that starting with the positive is wrong, or they push back on the notion of starting with the positive and they think that it's wrong because they think it sets the student up for not understanding consequences and that we aren't holding them accountable. But this really isn't true, because we can always become more punitive if we really need to. But if we've done nothing to establish a relationship with that student or help the student learn how to be successful, then we're missing the point. I can accept feedback from someone that I know cares about me, but if that feeling isn't there, I'm probably not going to be as willing to listen to that feedback. So we have to be positive. We have to focus on teaching the skill, and focusing on the positive piece of that is what helps the kid learn. And this is where we really have to use our expertise in behavior to assist teachers in understanding how behavior changes really work. They want things to get better as quickly as possible and for good reason, but it's just not really how change happens. These students have developed these maladaptive coping skills for a reason. They aren't working perfectly as evidenced by some of their struggles, but they do have their purpose, and they've been ingrained in them for X amount of years. So we can't expect to see change in just 1 week. And also we know that sometimes things get worse before they get better. So if we think of like behavioral therapy, this would be called an extinction burst. I always use this example when explaining it. When I was in college, there was a side door on one of the buildings that led directly to the hallway straight in front of the classroom that I needed to go to. And so it was always like another minute or so walk to get to go to the front door and then go back around where I needed to go. So I always slipped right into that door right before class started. And then about halfway through the semester, this door started being locked on the regular. So what do you think I did the first day it was locked? Do you think that I just turned the knob and moved on? No, like of course not. I turned it harder. I wiggled the door. At first, I could not accept that this door wasn't opening for me. It always opened for me. And several days after that, I checked that door every single day to see if it was going to open. And even once I realized that that door was going to stay locked, it didn't stop me from trying on occasion, especially if I was running late. Students are the same way. If a maladaptive coping skill has ended up getting them what they needed, they're going to keep using it. And when that no longer works, they're going to escalate to make things more predictable. If I'm overwhelmed by my math and I rip it up and I get to leave the room, I'm going to keep ripping it up because I'm so overwhelmed and triggered by this math work. So if I can no longer get to leave when this happens because the teacher has come in with a new paper or has said, hey, I can see that you're struggling and I'm here to help, I might try yelling. Students are going to try to get things back to what they know. And sometimes we can abandon an intervention that will work, that will end up working too early because we don't see immediate change or we see them escalate. But that's actually part of the process sometimes. So we need to give our intervention about 2 weeks of actual fidelity before making modifications and trying something different. So a great segue into this point is that we have to look at the data to know if what we are doing is working, because behavior change is a slow process. And we have to know what that baseline is before we start the intervention. Because if a student has 8 outbursts a day and it reduces to 6, the intervention is obviously working. But if we're not collecting that data, we might not see the change outright because 6 is still a lot of times. So if we don't have that number down definitively, it's going to feel like no progress has been made. Or maybe the intensity or duration of an outburst has been decreasing slowly but surely. Maybe the student used to have 30-minute outbursts, and now it's reduced to 20 minutes based off of your intervention. That's not really going to feel like a change, and that's why we need to have that baseline data, and we need to be collecting data during, so we can really know if it's not working and not just rely on how we feel about it or what we think about it. Keep that data collection process as simple as possible and create it collaboratively with the classroom teachers so that they feel like it's a manageable thing to maintain. And so we know this part in our heads, don't give up, but it's not always in our hearts because students are complex. We don't always have all the information and all the puzzle pieces, and there's so much more behind the curtain that we may never know, like what they're taught at home, how they're treated. There might be underlying unidentified issues. There might be trauma responses that don't make sense to us and unknown triggers. We might not get it right the first time, but keep at it because we all know this, that students deserve to not be given up on. And we are not the type of people to give up on a student. So we're just going to take a little bit of time and talk about some of the more frequently occurring things that we see at school. So the first one is disruptive behavior disorders. So this includes things like conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, things like that. School can be a very challenging place for students with one or more disruptive behavior disorders, or DBDs. School, we talked about this earlier, that kind of cyclical thing of students have a hard time, school has a hard time responding, their responses make it harder for the students responses to that make it harder for the staff. And so we might be responding to students with a focus on discipline rather than attending to their mental health needs. And one issue with this is that these students tend to feel chronically unloved and abandoned, and they see their relationships with adults in terms of power, control, and fairness. So they have an exaggerated sense that authority figures are out to control them. So we can see how when we respond to just discipline, this is just reinforcing this and perpetuating that cycle. So there is a number of research for these students that say that group interventions are actually not wise for this population because they really need positive friendships and role models. And when students with DBDs become friends with other students with DBDs, it exacerbates their issues and symptoms and perpetuates their problems. So if they're all grouped together, they're with peers that model those same negative coping skills that they're using. So, for example, if you're in a group and you say something and one of the students says something rude and they get a laugh out of it from a peer, they're more likely to continue that behavior because they crave the connection, because these students really, really need to feel connected to their peers. If you really need to work with them in a group, then make sure that it's a group mixed with students that can act as role models along with the students who struggle. But individually, when possible, is best practice. And we also have to make sure that we are trying to understand the student and what is underneath that behavior. Because remember, we're looking for triggers and maintaining variables so that we can help minimize them and accommodate them. So we really have to understand the student, because some may love to be recognized in front of their peers for their positive behavior, and that might be a really helpful thing to do with them, but others may as soon run through the wall before attention is brought to them. I've included some surveys that are used to help understand students' motivators and to help understand students a little bit better. They're mixed. They're a mix of some that you do with the student, some that you give to the parent to do, and that are some that are done collaboratively with the teacher and parent. And these are all linked in my session notes. So in terms of dysfunctional thinking, we've already discussed how these students think that we're out to control them. So we really need to help students examine their projections of those thoughts onto others. So role play with them as they examine others' perceptions and intentions, because most of the time they're probably having a skewed idea of what's really happening. And what the intent of the authority figure is when they're talking to them in some way. We also want to talk about alternative ways to solve problems. CBT is very effective with this population. We need to be teaching them relaxation training, thought reframing, and the last point says use behavioral momentum. And what that means is we're starting with high probability requests, something that we're sure that they're going to do. Hey, can you get your pencil out and write your name on your paper? Things that we know they're going to be willing to do that. And then we praise that compliance and then make the more challenging requests. So we're starting with small things. And then by the time we get to the real ask, it's just one small step further than the things that we've been progressing to. So behavioral momentum is really helpful with this population. And the other thing is and this is for every student across the board, and we already know this, but it's just always worth mentioning that it's the relationship first. They really have to believe that you care, and they really have to believe that you're there for them, and that you're not just there to make school easier for all of the staff, that you care about them, that you care about their success, and that is going to require a lot of grace, a lot of patience, a lot of persistence, and a lot of times where your feelings may be hurt, and you're going to have to figure out how to deal with that, because one of the things I remind myself a lot is I'm the grown-up here. I'm the grown-up here. I get to go home to my safe place, my safe environment with my supportive family and my supportive friends. Not everybody gets that gift. So I have to remind myself of those things, that when they have an outburst towards me, that sometimes is not even about me. And so every day they get a new day. Every day is a fresh start. And every day they're going to know that I value them and that I care about them. So now let's talk about ADHD for a bit. So ADHD can at times be placed in the DBD category, but there's so much more to cover, so we're addressing it as a standalone. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about all the ways that ADHD can manifest in students, because I feel like most of us are pretty aware of these things. We know it looks different in boys than it does in girls. We know that it is overdiagnosed. We know that we need to make sure we're seeing the full picture before we jump to the conclusion of ADHD. But we also know that ADHD is real, and we know that it creates unique challenges for students who have it, and therefore we need to be ready to address it. And so some of the interventions for these students include giving immediate feedback. These students have a lot of trouble staying on task, organizing, and planning. And so it helps them the immediate feedback helps them to learn the skills, and it increases predictability for them. We know by writing 504s that preferential seating is really key for these students. They need to be close to their teachers. I used to actually talk a lot in class, and so my teacher pushed this was in third grade, my teacher pushed my desk up next to hers. Well, that actually backfired for her, because I loved it, and I was so successful that I never wanted to leave. And in sixth grade, it was kind of the same thing. I was put into this island desk that was basically its own cubicle. Like, it had walls that prevented me from seeing anything but what I was supposed to be focusing on. And once again, I was actually forced to leave the island. Even though I begged to stay there because it helped me so much. And so if I was a school counselor at that school, I would first of all say, hey, we're not going to be doing punitive things that separate the student even more from the class, first of all. But I would also say, if the student is saying that something is working well for them, let's listen to their expertise, because they know themselves, and they are starting to learn how they learn, which is an important thing for all of us to know. And so the next point, action-oriented, it kind of makes me think of that song, like a little less conversation, a little more action, but like not in the way the song means. But we as grown-ups like to talk. We like to share our rationale. We like to help students understand. And we like to make sure that everything makes sense and over-explain ourselves a lot of the time. But this is not good practice for students with ADHD. Our lectures are not high interest, so they're not going to retain much of what we say. We need to focus on our behaviors so that they communicate what we need to say. So if we're teaching and a student has snuck out a book, all we really need to be doing is taking a walk over to their desk, and as we're speaking, and stand there, and usually students will put the book away. So we need to be using few words and actions that communicate, because for these students, that's going to connect with their brains better than a lecture is. And I say lecture, I don't even mean it like a punitive lecture, just a way to explain things to them. We need to be action oriented. Also, students with ADHD do not often respond to the typical positive reinforcers the way other students do. So we need to make sure that our feedback to them is especially meaningful. If a student raises their hand and we call on them, that's a reinforcer. The student knows I raised my hand, I have a chance to get called on. But for a student with ADHD, if we're working on something like, not blurting out the answer, if we see them raise their hand, we're going to say something like, "Thank you, Missy, for raising your hand," and then we call on them. Do-overs are a super effective real-time intervention. Like going back to the blurting out example, if a student blurts out an answer, you can say, "Why don't you do that over?" and raise your hand. This gives the student an opportunity to rectify the issue immediately and in a non-shame inducing way. If a student isn't very respectful to you, you could say, "Do you want to try saying that again more respectfully?" Of course, it doesn't work every time, but it works more than it doesn't. This is also referred to as a redo, and it's a part of TBRI, which I referenced again, or I referenced earlier in the presentation. If you have a chance to go to one of their trainings, I highly recommend it. It was one of the most professionally transformative trainings I've ever been to. It gives a lot of really concrete ideas that help students who have experienced trauma. And, we've kind of been learning that even the interventions that are especially helpful for students with trauma are good for every kid. And a redo or a do-over is good for every kid because it gives them an opportunity to right whatever wrong that's happened, but also it gives them the muscle memory of doing that right thing, of taking that right action. We also need to provide students with ADHD with extra movement. Allow them to stand at their desks. Have teachers send those students on errands if needed. If they have a book that needs to be returned, have that student be the one to go do it. If you are having sessions with them, have them be active, toss a ball around together, or take a walk together at the end before they go back to class. Another thing that you can do is you can give them structure and stay consistent. It is very stressful for a student, especially a student with ADHD, to be able to do one thing one day and then the next day it's unacceptable. We have to have structure for them, and we have to have consistency. And that's also a trauma-informed practice. The old idea of sit and get really isn't good for any kid. So we need to adapt because now we know even better how students learn, and we need to change our ineffective practices. And the last thing here is teaching organizational strategies. This is good, again, for every student, but students with ADHD, this is a must learn. It is a life skill, and some of us have natural systems. Some of us, if you're like me, have had many, many systems, and most of the time the issue is that it's hard to make systems a part of our regular practice. So we think that they don't work, but really we just haven't worked to make that system a habit. So we have to help students know what works for them, and we have to then help keep them accountable and make those strategies part of their routine. So that could be something like keeping a homework planner, or writing things down of their day, or writing down the things, their goals that they're working on, and keeping those in visible display. For you elementary people out there, Hunter and his amazing remote control is a really good resource for students with ADHD. It teaches about thinking about their choices before acting, teaching them how to notice when their brain changes channels. So it's a concrete way of talking about something that's a lot more abstract. So then if you're working on if you're working with a student and you're able to share some of that language with the teacher, then if a teacher notices that the student is zoned out, they can say to the student, hey, change your channel back onto me, because Hunter's remote control, he learns that sometimes my channel can be on school, but sometimes my channel might switch and it might go to what I'm going to eat for lunch later. And there's a lot of different buttons on the remote that are really helpful, like a rewind button to think about, well, what happened when I had this problem, and what can I do differently next time? So it's just a really good, like I said, it's a really good resource to talk about something that's really abstract for kids to understand in a more concrete way. And I have linked that along with the workbook on the meeting notes. Okay, so anxiety. Anxiety is often misunderstood and misinterpreted by others because it doesn't always think and look how you think it's going to look. Just yesterday, I was talking to a teacher, and we're standing there calmly, and I said, hey, how was your day? And she said, it's been a really rough day. I am just totally overwhelmed with anxiety. And she's talking to me as I'm talking to you right now. You would never know. Right? So we don't always even see anxiety. And sometimes we think, oh, the student is so well behaved, and the student has, such a hard worker, but really they can't make a mistake because they're too scared of what will happen. Or, if a student has OCD and is ruminating, that can look a lot like ADHD inattentive type. Or it can look like a student who has a disruptive behavior disorder when they actually have anxiety because they're so fearful that their fight, flight, or freeze response is triggered. So here's some intervention ideas. First of all, I highly recommend the book Freeing Your Child from Anxiety by Tamar Chonsky. It's written to parents, but it has really practical ideas that we can also use as professionals. So one of the things that we can talk about with students is externalize. And so we say things like, what is worry bugging you about? Or what is worry telling you to think here? So we've taken that worry outside of them, and it's no longer who they are. It's something that's bothering them and something that they can combat. Side-by-side comparison. So we don't tell kids what to think. Instead, we ask questions about what they want to think. And so we write down, what is worry telling you? And then on the other side, well, what do you think? And this can be done both by you as the counselor, or even in a conversation that a teacher has once they learn a little bit about this. Because they can't help the worry thoughts that pop into their head, but they can choose what voice to believe. Another thing that we need to remember is avoid speaking in generalities. And this is for every educator. And what I mean by that is students with anxiety, if you're talking about a whole group, if you're saying you guys, most of you guys really weren't very respectful to the sub yesterday. Well, that student might have done everything in their power to be perfect, and now they feel as though, I wasn't good enough, I didn't do it right. So we want to avoid speaking in, lumping students together as a whole. The other thing is we want to make sure that when we're explaining something, we're not making the exception to the rule seem like the reality. Students with anxiety really need the perspective that the words like rarely, slim chance, not often, those things provide. They need that perspective. So what I mean by that is I'll give you an example. Let's say that they're in science class and they're talking about some of the risks of this science experiment, and the teacher says something like, we're going to be wearing goggles because we wear goggles when we're working with dangerous chemicals, so that way if it's splashed in our eye, it can make us go blind. A non-anxious student might hear that and think okay, we'll wear the goggles. But an anxious student might have heard goggles, blah, 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 you lose your eye. And so it would be better to say we wear goggles to prevent damage to your eyes in the rare chance that these chemicals are spilled. So you can see it's a really small change, and it doesn't seem like it would make a huge difference, but it is a huge one to anxious students. We need to be telling them, okay, we might be warning you about something, but this doesn't happen often. We just want you to know on the rare occurrence that it could happen. We're also going to work to minimize triggers. Now, it's not appropriate within the school setting for us to take on the responsibility of desensitizing students to triggers, of course, but we can help by creating a less triggering environment to them. And so we want them to be prepared, but not scared. We want them to understand things. We want them to feel like they can meet expectations, that they know what they are, so they have that security. The other thing that's really important is to make sure that they feel safe, because there's a major difference between felt safety versus actual safety. We as the grown-up know, hey, you're physically safe here, but that student, maybe it gets really loud in that classroom, and that loudness is really triggering for them because they're yelled at a lot at home. Maybe it's too chaotic in there, or maybe it's too quiet, or maybe they don't like sitting by the window with their back to it because they can't see behind them and they can't know what's coming. We need to be working on not only making sure that they are physically safe, but that they feel safe. And then we also want to make sure that we're teaching students about worry and what worry thoughts. At my school, we often, like if I ask a student, what are 2 words that a worry thought often starts with, they'll be able to say to you, what if? Because oftentimes a worry thought starts with, what if? And so it's kind of like I can't remember what that comedian said. It was like, you might be a redneck if, well, you might be anxious if you're hearing this what if thought. So, and then the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to, this idea of the ideal response, this is not only for students with anxiety, but it's also this is across the board a good response. And so what IDEAL stands for is immediate, direct, efficient, action-based, and leveled at behavior and not the child. I don't have a lot of time to explain this, but this is what you say. This is a manner of talking to a student about their behavior. I've linked a short, really helpful video that explains the ideal response. It's a TBRI practice, and it's really helpful for you to not only watch yourself, but watch to your staff. And one example of a not ideal response is if you see a student across the room doing something and you yell, "Hey, Missy, like, stop that. We shouldn't be doing that, right?" We should actually go over to that student, get approximate to them, look at their level, and respond to the behavior that way. And it's really helpful to kind of understand what that acronym means in more detail. So I really encourage you to go check out that video. The other thing is we need to be helping students help themselves, because what they think they want is for you to rescue them. But what they actually need is for you to support them. Your best tool is not to convince or assure the student that they're okay. Your best tool is to be asking questions like, what is worry telling you? Do you think that's really true? What do you think is most likely to happen? Because they might tune you out if you try to lecture them and assure them that they're safe, but they have a harder time ignoring their own voice that has led them to identify some truths through their own logic. And the last thing we're going to be talking about, and I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to go fast, is our mood disorders. So we often think that understanding how you feel on the inside is an innate skill, but there are just many students who do not have the words to describe what's going on inside of them, because they don't know what those feelings are. It's really hard to ask for help when you cannot figure out for sure if anything's wrong. Helping students understand what emotions are, how they're felt in our body, and that they can be challenged can be really powerful information to pass on to them. It's also helpful to help students understand that feelings exist on a continuum. Sometimes they're stronger than other times. Knowing that they ebb and flow helps students begin to understand that that feelings can be changed. So one way to do this is to print out a thermometer and have students map out their feelings on a thermometer. The Zones of Regulation curriculum is also really helpful in this area. The other thing that we need to be teaching is that feelings are not facts. Students with mood disorders and have negative thought patterns that need to be challenged. Have students complete thought logs. There are thousands of easily Googleable, that's not a word, easy to Google thought logs that are student friendly, that are free and can just be printed off. Have a student complete one. Coach them through the process a few times and then give them some blank copies to do themselves. There's phone apps that do that too, that are free. Have students explore the evidence for and against their thought. When I explain this to students, I'm elementary, so I kind of, I kind of beef it up a little bit and I get really animated, but I say something like, there's been a crime and we know that the suspect had on a red shirt. And then I'll point to a student that has that shirt color on if there's someone that I know can handle that. And I'll say, we've arrested this student. And then I'll say, this student ended up telling me that they weren't even in town last night and they have the evidence to prove it, but I'm going to arrest them anyways because they're wearing the color shirt that the suspect had on. And then I ask the class, am I a good detective? And of course they're going to say no. And so I say it's the same with our thoughts. We take one piece of the puzzle and we let it define our entire reality. Our brains trick us sometimes, so we have to be brain detectives and we have to examine the clues. And we can help teachers do that too and help teachers coach students through this. So for example, they can gently help a student challenge a thought like, hey, I heard you saying you're going to fail this test. Do you really think that's true? Is there another way of thinking that might serve you better? Another thing that we need to be doing is maximizing their potential for success. So students with mood disorders are not often able to obtain sufficient reinforcement, positive reinforcement from their environment. So we need to increase the positive reinforcement that they obtain. Praise their effort and their work ethic, not the product of it or their intellect, because research indicates that students with mood disorders often have negative self-concepts. So praising their intellect can actually discourage them because they think only students who are smart and they do not categorize themselves as such are successful. So if we give the message that school is for the purpose to learn new skills and give effort, those students are much more likely to buy into that idea instead of us just trying to say, you're so smart, you're going to do such a good job at this. Really say you're a hard worker and school is for learning. School is for making mistakes. School is the safe place that you do that because mistakes help us learn. And so I included the some of the references that I have read that helped me prepare for this. One of the things that I want to say is most of these references I've found through obtaining ASCA-U certifications. Like I said before, I'm working on the mental health specialist one. Last year, I obtained the anxiety specialist one, and the resources that they provide for the research they're just really, really wonderful and have made me better at my job. So I've linked both of the links to those trainings. You get a discount if you're an ASCA member. But a lot of these books, they're available on Amazon. I also linked those in our meeting notes as well. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I put my school counselor website on there. It's not really a website that you would typically visit, but in case the hyperlinks don't work, I'm going to on the meeting notes and you want to look at those, you can come to this website and I'll have it linked up with all of the links active so you can look through that and click on them. I'm always one email away. I do have a school counselor and Twitter and Instagram. And I love to connect with people like that because I've learned so much just from seeing what other school counselors are doing online. And then the last thing is, this is just a credit for the people who provided this template for free. I'm sure most of you guys know about this, but Slides Carnival, Slides Go, they're all free and are already formatted for you, ready to go, that look a little bit more fun, and I don't have to spend all that time making something. So I do have to credit it, but I am grateful to the people who spent all that time so I didn't have to. All right, you guys, it was wonderful to get to hang out with you guys. And if you need anything, like I said, I'm one email away. Have a good day. Bye, everybody.